Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name is Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Health Care Needs out of the Waisman Center. And this is time that we set aside to talk about what's important to families and people that are supporting families in usually a very casual sort of conversational way. Today, we're going to mix it up a little bit. We are very excited that Kate Szidon has joined us. Kate has been working with the Secondary Education for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorders projects, also shortened as CSESA, because in Wisconsin we have CSESAs, and so why not also have a project called CSESA just to confuse us? So we're really excited that they do that. But CSESA has been helping families and IEP teams look at what does a quality transition IEP look like for students with autism spectrum disorder. Kate works with me out at the Waisman Center, or I work with Kate. I think you were hired first. So I think I work with Kate.
That's really close.
Right about the same time.
Yeah.
We work together. We work together at the Waisman Center. So I'm really excited that she could join us today. I will be monitoring the chat feature. So please feel free to put any questions that you might have in chat. And we will go ahead and Kate, go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here today, and I love talking about transition planning. So I am going to encourage everyone to put any burning questions you might have about transition plans into the chat, and Tim is going to help me by monitoring that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. And I wanted to encourage everyone to feel free to interrupt me. I am happy to have this conversation go any direction that works for people. And I want to be able to answer any questions that you might be coming to this presentation with. So we are very flexible about our schedule. But I thought this would be a helpful way to kind of discuss transition planning through the lens of the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism, which is the project that we recently completed here in Wisconsin. And this is just a little bit of information about the project, because the recommendations that I'm going to talk about for students on the autism spectrum really come out of the expertise from this project. And it was a very large multi-site high school project that was trying to find interventions for students in high school. And so we did work in 20 high schools across Wisconsin. We might have worked in some of the high schools you're familiar with, but I will not tell you which ones because we keep that information confidential. So this might be familiar information to some of you. Tim, are there any questions that are coming up in the chat right away that I should be aware of? Or
none right away. I
Okay,
did
great.
just put the link for CSESA in there. So if people wanted to look at something other than the slideshow and you, they could pop on over to the CSESA page and see what other resources that you guys have developed.
And that's a live site that should be up for quite a while. It's grant funded, so we do have to find a way to continue funding it, but we hope that it will be there for a long time because there's a lot of really nice free resources on that site. And I'd be happy to share or talk through how to find some of them if you're looking for something other than transition IEPs. So to start with, the CSESA project consulted with a lot of different universities and experts in the United States to figure out how might a transition IEP for a student on the autism spectrum look different? And our recommendations are that these IEPs should address the domains that are likely to affect students who have autism, which sounds pretty, like that makes sense. But you would be surprised in the field, you don't always see all of these areas addressed in a IEP. And so we really are encouraging teachers to make sure that you're including independence and behavior, transition, and social skills in all IEPs for students on the autism spectrum. And there's going to be varying levels of need in these areas, but they should at least be looked at, is our recommendation. So I'm going to talk from this transition services flow chart, which you can see comes from Seattle University. And what I like about it is, see how the IEP goals are at the very bottom? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we should all be thinking about before we ever come to the table to write an IEP. And so I'm going to kind of go through step by step and talk about each of these steps in that flow chart. And obviously we will start with age-appropriate transition assessments. And so all IEPs should have some assessments done and documented to justify where you think that child is doing really well and things that they need to work on. And a transition assessment is that ongoing process of collecting data on needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future work, education, living, and personal and social environments. And so we want to make sure that everyone's thinking about assessments in all of these areas and the different ways that you can collect information about not only how well a student is doing in their classes academically, but what their needs are and their interests are once they're done with school. So a transition assessment should address the areas of employment, education and training, and independent living. And you'll see the way that the IEP is designed, that these areas are outlined and asked about. And so as a team, you should really talk about all of them. And if you're not going to include one of these areas, because sometimes we don't include independent living if we believe that that student is not going to have difficulties in that area. But if we do believe that there aren't any difficulties, we should have justification and assessment to demonstrate that. I just am pointing out to you, the project came up with a tool that's free and accessible to everyone that we call the Secondary School Success Checklist. And it's designed specifically to kind of get at these areas and particularly how they might affect a student on the autism spectrum. And I don't know if this is big enough for everyone to read. Tim, do you think it's big enough for people to see clearly?
If you could like zoom in as you talk about a section, that'd probably be a little more helpful.
Oops. I'm trying to figure out how I would zoom.
I'll also be adding the page into the chat if they want to go look it up online. Ooh, that's nice.
Awesome. Okay. Oh, I'm learning new things. So for example, there's several different domains. This is just the independence and behavior domain that I'm giving you as an example. And as you can see on the left column here, we can assess a student's skills in any of these areas. And then as you move across the document, once you've decided how that student does on these skills, you can decide how important do you think it is to teach those skills. And what I like about the SSSC is not only does it allow teachers to do this assessment, but it allows students to do it and it allows parents to do it. So you can have 3 different people rating your child or your students' skill priorities in preparation for writing a plan. And there's lots of domains and subdomains to consider. Okay, and please let me know if you have questions about this. So I'm also going to talk about some other assessments that we not only recommend, but also are giving some sort of examples of ways to collect the information. So we also think that it's really important to look at self-determination. Many people know what we mean by self-determination, but for those who don't, we're really talking about a student's self-advocacy skills, their ability to manage their own behavior, their comfort and ability making choices and solving problems. Those all influence self-determination. And self-determination, as you can imagine, is a very strong predictor of success for everybody. because you really have to know how to advocate for yourself and manage yourself to succeed after high school, because there's not going to be anyone around sort of scaffolding that for you the way we do when kids are still in school and have special education teachers to help with things like problem solving and choice making and managing your own responsibilities. So self-determination is something that we encourage people to start working on young and to really think about and monitor across the IEP. Here's some self-determination assessments, just for those people who don't necessarily know where to find something to really look at self-determination. There's lots out there that have been made. The AIRS is a self-determination assessment that's free online. You should be able to find that just by plugging it into a Google search, as is the ARC self-determination scale. And then there's a couple that you could buy. For example, the Choicemaker Self-Determination Assessment or the Field and Hoffman Self-Determination Battery. So for those of you looking for self-determination assessment tools, these are some that are out there. In the area of independent living, I just wanted to point out there's tons of stuff available. I remember when I was a special ed teacher, we used the Vineland a lot. I used the Brigance when I had students who might have more beginning skills that I was looking at, because I typically taught students from 5th to 12th grade, but a Brigance would kind of help figure out what those beginning skills might be that they're working on. And then you can see there's a couple of other ones out there. So I recommend, if you're interested in looking at independent living, that we are looking at some standardized tools as well as other ways of assessing where your child or your student is at. So these are things you can ask for in an IEP meeting, or as a teacher, you could ask your school psychologist if they have access to these tools, and we could use them for assessment. There's also lots and lots of career assessments available. Lots of schools have things like career cruising that they have licenses online for, and kids will use those sometimes with the guidance counselor. Sometimes they'll have a class where they work on those things. But often that's not nearly enough time for our students on IEPs to really explore all that these tools have to offer, especially things like ONET and career cruising. They're very, very, there's just tons and tons of information you can get about careers and learning about things that you're interested in, finding out where jobs are and what kind of salary you would get, what kind of training you would need. I've also used this self-directed search that's up here. This is a tool that you have to buy a license for, and it's more of a soft skills tool. You take an assessment independently, and then it kind of spits out some careers that might match with your interests and your strengths. That one's kind of surprising sometimes, because it's really not looking at, like, it's not asking you what kind of job you want. It's asking you what kind of things you like to do and what you think you're good at. And so sometimes that's interesting for students who have like less experience working in person. So that's a really, that's kind of a neat tool to start a conversation. This is just a reminder that all assessments results should be documented in your IEP somewhere. For teachers, you'll know where that is. For parents, sometimes you don't always know. So you can find assessment information often in the present level of performance, which is that big paragraph at the very beginning that kind of describes how your child's doing in school. There's sometimes an assessment results section in IEPs, or they might outline some assessment results in a concerns section. And every 3 years, we're required by law to redetermine eligibility. That's a bigger meeting that you usually have with a school psychologist. And often, if they do standardized or observational testing, there should be a report that you get. And that would be a report from not only a school psychologist, but some people would have like speech and language pathologists or OT reports as well. So that can be a lot of information, and it should document some testing results in there.
And Kate, I just want to interject that, one of the things that I was on a session on transition on Monday night, and I know as a parent of a child with special health care needs and talking to other parents that when our children have been in the school system for years, sometimes there's just this tendency to sign off on that 3-year evaluation. Nothing much has changed. He's still getting services. He's still eligible, blah, blah. And so we sign off that, no, you don't need to do another assessment. Really encourage parents that when their child is in high school, as they're getting ready for that transition, to not waive the 3-year reevaluation. Is that evaluation in high school, especially toward the end of high school, will give valuable information to the next step providers. So to like the Aging Disability Resource Center, to long-term supports. And so I know we get used to saying, yep, we're fine. We don't need to do the reeval. In high school, really encourage parents to say, we want that 3-year reevaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, Tim. And I would even go a step further and say you might have an opportunity in your district to ask for assessments that are normed on adults, which can be really helpful when kids go to college, because often colleges are looking for what we call adult normed assessment results, meaning that the number that they spit out, be it an IQ test or like an independent living evaluation, would be comparing your child's performance on that test to other adults' performances rather than kids. Because what we often find is that if you spend many years waiving those assessments, you might only have an assessment from when a child is really young. And what we know about developmental disabilities is, there may be delays, but kids really make progress across school. And so you really want to have a documentation of what that progress looks like and how that compares to other young adults' skill sets. So that can be really helpful for college disability resource services, as well as probably other services that you get through the adult service agencies.
Oh, I totally agree. I love that point too about colleges, because college, if you go to the disability resource services at a colleges, they're going to ask for some sort of documentation. And so the other thing to remember is, I know it's a lot of paperwork, but to find some sort of storage mechanism, because the school is not going to keep all the IEPs. The school's not going to keep all the evaluations, and you are going to need, especially that latest one, as you move through transition. So whatever is given to you, especially during high school from the school, make sure you keep it, because you may need to refer to that for the next step of your child.
Yeah, really good point. So, so these reports are things that you can kind of look in your own IEPs to see what you have and where that might be. If you have any questions about where to find that information, we're always available at the Waisman Center. You can always ask your school, your resource room teacher or somebody, a school psychologist, whoever you trust, to help you understand the paperwork, because obviously that paperwork, like Tim was saying, it's a lot of paper and it's sometimes very tiring to go through it. And so it's nice to have somebody who's really familiar with it sort of point out to you where things are.
So we do have a couple questions that are coming through in the chat. The first one is, have you heard of services being denied based on a school's IQ assessment?
Well, when we're determining eligibility, sometimes IQ plays into whether a student is eligible under a certain category. And so I guess the short answer would be yes, but if you wanted to elaborate, I might be able to help if there was something like a certain eligibility that you were.
I know they are joining us from rural Wisconsin and the internet body where they are. So they may be able to unmute and give us a little more. I'll also be watching the chat. but I think it points, one of the things that it makes me think of is, as you were talking about the three different main areas of transition assessment, is it's not just about the intellect,
No.
it's about the skills. And, IEPs can be utilized to help improve a student's skills that will help them learn. And so relying on just what some would say an antiquated IQ assessment should never be the sole reason. Is there needs to be other things involved, in my opinion.
And sorry for toggling back and forth, because I did make this presentation a little bit shorter than I typically do it. And what I didn't include was informal assessment information, which is also very important. And so, for example, if your child is eligible for an IEP as a student with autism, IQ wouldn't necessarily, your IQ shouldn't necessarily affect whether or not you get services. It might point people in a direction one way or another to the type of services that your child would benefit from, depending on what that assessment would tell you. But in addition to the assessment, they should be looking at their performance, their grades in school, how they're doing socially, what their independent living skills are. We put a big emphasis in CSESA on independent living skills, because as you can see, there's those three areas that you really want to focus on. And often independent living skills, because it's kind of an optional, like, oh, only if you need it category for a transition IEP, people will kind of check that box of, oh no, they don't need that help. But when you actually talk to families, or if you do a formal assessment, most often you'll find students on the autism spectrum, and even those students who have average to above average IQs will have significant challenges in the areas of independent living. And when we talk about independent living, we talk about things like their ability to manage their time, get their homework in. At home, it might be things like, can they get dressed and out the door in the morning? Can they make appointments for themselves when they need to go to the doctor? Do they know how to tie their shoes? All those pieces and parts that help somebody live without supports can really be impacted, even for students who do very well academically on the autism spectrum. So independent living is an area that we really encourage teams to look at closely and write goals around as needed, because it can really affect your success in school after high school. If you have challenges with independent living, can you really live in a dorm and get your homework done and get to class on time? Those kinds of things.
Yep. And the independent living skill that I, of course, like to remind people of is the taking care of your own health and managing your own health care. Do you know how prescriptions are filled? Do you know how to pick up your prescriptions? Some very important things surrounding health can be covered as well under independent living skills. We do have another, so as we're talking about the importance of independent living skills, have you seen, in your experience with CSESA, we have a parent who's going to ask the school about making access to some employment opportunities during the school day, because they are so involved in extracurriculars that they don't want to do the employment stuff after school, because that would pull them away from their social group, pull them away from social curricular. Have you heard about schools or other people navigating that request about doing some allowance during daytime for employment skills?
I mean, it's certainly a possibility. If a child is on an individualized education program, that means that they need some flexibility in how their school day looks. But typically, the IEP is designed to help students access general ed curriculum. And so employment should really enhance, what their outcomes are for completing their degree, or completing their high school diploma and getting a job or going to college, whatever it is they might want to do. Certainly, we have had lots of students when I've worked in high schools who have gotten some supports from special education to apply for and do jobs. They might need job support on the job, and we've often staffed to provide that kind of support so that students can practice job skills. So hopefully that answers your question.
And we'll continue with a couple more questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you recommend any curriculum for schools to use around independent living?
Oh, wow. I guess so it's a really big bucket. So it really depends on the skill level of the student, and then also the type of independent living skills that we find are, challenging for them. One thing I will, just to backtrack a little to the previous question, I wanted to make a plug for Department of Vocational Rehabilitation as well as a partner. And we'll talk a little bit about how there should be partnerships in the IEP, but DVR is a great partner for employment. And if there's employment goals that student has who wants to be able to work during the school day, having DVR at the IEP might be really helpful for that family. But in terms of independent living skills curriculum, most districts will have some kind of curriculum to address independent living skills. But often what we find for students on the autism spectrum is really practicing real life skills in real life situations can be the most helpful. So depending on the skill that you're trying to build, you might want to enroll your child or talk to your child about enrolling themselves in like a home ec class, for example, or a money management class. Some schools provide independent living skills in a special classroom environment, and that might encompass quite a few different kinds of skills. So it's really depending on what kind of skills you're looking to work on.
Well, and that goes back to a question too about how can a school setting help a student learn or master some of the skills needed to successfully live independently. Talk about skills needed such as hygiene, medication management, time management.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's always little ways you can build those into a student's school day. You don't always necessarily have to have a formal class to do that, but you might have built a plan with, some supports in place, whether that be instructional assistant support or visual supports or technology supports that would help that student practice those skills. And again, it really depends. Like if you wanted to name a specific skill that you're looking for, I could rack my brains because I have worked on a lot of independent living skills with students. But yeah, like as part of a team, being creative about how to embed that in the school day, I think is really the trick to independent living skills. And then accessing all of those things that a high school might offer that could help reinforce those skills.
And I think one of the things that you said earlier, and I'll just reference back to the fact that one of the most important things that parents can do if this is a skill that needs to be worked on is to get it into the IEP, is to talk to the IEP team, because what sort of what I'm reading too in the chat is what we have is these students that are like falling into a gap. So they're not going to pick it up naturally like most students will. And so, some schools don't have just independent living skills for all students. They just assume the students will pick it up. And then their independent living skills are for some of the higher disability, the higher needs students. And so sometimes, especially our kiddos with autism, aren't going to fit into that group either. And so they're not going to fit into the, that really necessary group, but if they don't get independent living skills, they're not going to be successful. So writing it into that IEP and saying, I think this is something that really needs to be looked at. And then the school should develop according to that student's independent needs, the I in the IEP. Is it hygiene, time management? What skills need to be developed in high school to help them succeed in employment and in college after high school?
Yeah, and feel free to throw some specific examples that you might be struggling with, and we can kind of talk about them as a group. I'm going to start moving a little forward because I see that we're getting along in time, so I want to make sure that we're not leaving any.
And we do have one of those that you just asked for.
Okay.
Kate. So one of my students struggles with changing their undergarments. They shower
Okay.
regularly, but don't necessarily use soap, shampoo, or put clean garments on, despite
Ooh.
verbal and visual cues.
Okay, great. That's a great example. So CSESA is there to help you. So the CSESA project, meaning the CSESA, like Tim was saying, has a website with lots and lots of resources on it. One of the things we've done in CSESA to work on things like showering might be an evidence-based practice called video modeling. So I can give you an example of a video model we did for showering. And don't worry, nobody was exposed in this video. We had a student that was having a lot of trouble showering because there's so many steps and pieces and parts to doing a shower correctly, so that you get everything washed and use the correct soap for the correct body part. So they made a video model with some preferred music for that student, so it would be more enticing for them to watch, of a sibling in a bathing suit taking a shower correctly and pointing out all the things that needed to be remembered when they were taking a shower. And the student watched that video model and then took a shower successfully after that and found it really enjoyable as well as hopeful. So that's like one example. That's something the school can help the family create, but obviously it would be in partnership. If you have, I have used school showers because obviously a lot of gym classes have showers to teach that skill with a visual support. So you might use a task analysis, which is sort of like a checklist of what are the steps you need to make sure you do when you're in a shower or changing your undergarments, so that they could have the steps in pictures and really remember how to discriminate when things are dirty or clean, because I'm assuming that would be the problem, right? Does that answer your question?
Hopefully it does. I'll keep looking in the chat. I also went ahead and threw in the link to CSESA's suggestion for school staff and parents on hygiene, which includes that checklist, the task, and the daily chart that you were just talking about. So
I need to bring you
yes,
everywhere,
yes,
Tim. There's a lot on in the CSESA website. Yeah, so he might be pointing to what we call, oh, I'm blanking now. So we have sort of like 4-page pamphlets on different topics.
Autism at a glance, hygiene and adolescence with ASD.
Yeah, and there's
Perfect.
lots and lots of at-a-glances that cover all sorts of different topics. And not only do they have suggestions in them, but they also have resources that you can go to online or buy books that will help with some of those curriculum ideas. So thanks for pointing that out, Tim. So after we've done our age-appropriate transition assessments, I want to move us into these post-secondary goals, because these can be really confusing for both teachers and parents. Once you reach the age of 14 in Wisconsin, we have to write post-secondary goals, preferably before we write IEP goals, so that we know the direction of the IEP. And these are the questions that we want to answer. Where are they going to work or engage in productive activities after they graduate? Where and how are students going to continue to learn or develop skills? And then where is the student going to live and how are they going to access adult services, participate in the community, and have fun? Okay. The post-secondary goal is not a contract. We are not guaranteeing that a student is going to get all these things. It's just a template for helping that student learn the skills they need to maximize their ability to achieve what they want to achieve, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes teachers get worried, like, well, if I write that they're going to go to college, are they going to, be really upset with me if that child doesn't get into the college? No, we're just going to figure out how to best prepare them so they have the best possible chance. Okay. This is a helpful formula for writing post-secondary goals. And it says after high school or after graduation, the student will do a measurable behavior and then where and how they're going to do that. And we want to be as specific as possible, because I think because of that fear of like attainment, a lot of people try and make them really general, and being too general isn't actually helpful because we don't know what to do with that goal. We want our goals to be smart. We want them to be measurable, and we want to know what we're working toward. So here's some examples of some post-secondary goals. These are the ones we would hope people would be writing. After graduation from high school, the student will attend a 4-year college to obtain an undergraduate degree in history and education to become a high school social studies teacher. Very attainable, very clear what the goal is and what they want. Now, keep in mind, this might change year to year. If you think back to when you were a kid and when you were trying to decide what you wanted to do when you grew up, even high schoolers and college students don't exactly know what they want to do for a career. And sometimes they think they know and then they change their mind. So it's okay for this to change, but it does give us a blueprint so that we know what classes that we want to make sure that student takes and what kind of skills they're going to need to develop. And obviously in this case, going to a 4-year college, you're going to need to graduate high school with a standard diploma, right? To get into high school, to college and get certified to teach high school social studies. So that should be a priority for the IEP team. In terms of employment, the student obviously wants to get a degree and work as a history teacher. And then here's that piece on independent living, that they're going to advocate for any accommodations they need to be successful in further education and employment. And so kind of like what Tim was saying, this is sort of the self-determination and the health piece, right? Is that there might be things that they need to put in place, and they need to know what they need so that they can be successful in college and in the workplace. So teaching some of those self-determination skills is probably going to be part of that student's IEP. Here's another example. This might be for a student that doesn't want to go to college, that they'll attend a course through a pathway to employment program at the community college, that they're going to graduate and be competitively employed, working 20 hours a week in retail. And then in terms of independent living, that they're going to assume responsibility for some of their living expenses. Now, can you see how that gives you a really good blueprint for an IEP? So starting with those post-secondary goals can be really, really helpful because there should be like a clear line from these goals to the annual goals that you're writing while they're still in school, that you're working on daily. Any questions about post-secondary goals?
Question is, should goals be realistic? Of course, I encourage my students not be self-limiting, but there are some careers that may be unattainable because of the nature of that career. So how do you balance that, those dreams and aspirational goals versus, realistically? How can you match those?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that's the question I always get. So you are not alone. Often students, I always think of transition as sort of like a process rather than a product, right? So you are developing that self-determination to understand what's attainable for you and what you enjoy doing. And the best way to do that for students on the autism spectrum is through direct experience with those careers. So obviously, if you have a student that wants to be Aaron Rodgers, you're not going to have a really great opportunity to actually see what a football player does from day to day, but you at least have a starting point to understand what that child values and what their strong interests are, so that you can build on those and develop some more reasonable and attainable skills based on some measurable post-secondary goals that come from a transition assessment. So to me, having unrealistic goals is really good information about where your student's at in terms of their understanding of transition. And you kind of know what work you have cut out for you in terms of learning more about themselves and what they're good at and where their skills lie, because often it's just an opportunity for you to help that student really understand their strengths. Because if you can direct them, yeah, go ahead, Tim.
No, I was going to say, and finding a similar to experience, like what they might have in the job, so they can try it out and hopefully figure it out for themselves that maybe this doesn't really fit who they are or
Yeah.
what their
Yeah.
abilities are.
Yeah. And,
So that,
I always think about, sometimes we'll talk with parents about, what was the first career you wanted when you were young, and I know for me, I wanted to be a veterinarian or, an opera singer. And then it was like, oh yeah, I actually don't enjoy a lot of pieces and parts of that job. And I think I would be really miserable doing that, but it does take time for you to learn that. Right. And the best way to learn it is to see it. Sometimes you can build on those unrealistic expectations too. So for example, if you have a student that loves football and thinks they're going to be Aaron Rodgers, maybe a reasonable opportunity would be getting as close to football as possible, right? By working in a football stadium or doing some, assistant coaching for the high school, things that are more attainable and give them a sense of what does it look like to live in that world and do that job or be close to that job, and where do my skills fit in?
well, Kate, I love this discussion so much that I'm going to stop it, which is odd, but I want to honor the time that we gave away to people, but we're only halfway through. And so I am hoping that you'll be able to come back. I'm actually hoping you can come back on like June 3rd.
Oh,
Same bat time, same bat channel. And we can continue with the rest of the transition services flow chart, because I really love the identified transition services, but I've enjoyed the question and the answers and the reality. So I will connect with you, like I said, hopefully maybe June 3rd, because I just happen to have that open on my calendar right now. But if not, we will come back. We'll make this part 1 of Kate Szidon and CSESA, and then we'll come back with part 2.
yeah, and I'm happy to share. If you're disappointed we didn't get to the total end, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. So just let us know if you'd like a copy.
Sounds good. And yes, so I will. I'll be sending out I'll be sending out an evaluation. Matter of fact, I'm going to put a feedback form, which go ahead and feel free to tell me how horrible we are, because I didn't allow Kate to get through her whole presentation. But this is some really good stuff. So I really do want to make sure that we have you back shortly while we're still on this train of thought, and hopefully everybody would be able to join us. So I apologize that there's not a lot of time left over, but I am going to go ahead and end the recording. I'll hang on for a little bit. And Kate, if you could just hang for a little bit, maybe there's other questions that we can go over, but then we'll bring you back. Okay, so thanks a lot for being here.